On the way back from New Britain, we talked foolishly, full of unfulfilled hopes about going home. We reasoned that our battered division could not be sent back into battle without a long rest in Australia, New Zealand, or even the States. We noted the extent to which our bodies were emaciated, the number of sores and rotting arms and legs, and argued to each other that by any criteria we were simply bound to be declared unfit for combat. We built air castles, wondering what place our division would occupy in the intricacies of the government's plans for regrouping troops, and counted heavily on the indisputable fact that we had already served the required 2 years abroad. Our hearts sang in anticipation of a speedy return home, and the result was powwow. "What's that?" asked Eloquent, surprised, having heard the name of the island for the first time from Lieutenant Liberal. "What kind of a name is that? Perhaps some cunning tropical disease." Pavuvuvu, grinned the lieutenant. "It's spelled with a capital P. Massacrations is do it. It's the name of the place we're going to. Pavuvu Island is one of the Solomon Islands." "It's a poetic name," Playboy said dreamily. "I'm sure it is," said Eloquent. The wind barely swayed the branches of palm trees. White beaches swooned under the gentle kisses of the blue sea. Half-naked islanders came out to greet us with songs and exotic flowers. "Are you there? Where are the naked beauties?" "It's going to be a magical fairy tale," continued Eloquent, ignoring the retort. "And when will we get there, Lieutenant?" "Tomorrow." We walked ashore in the pouring rain, climbed the slippery, slushy slope into a grove of coconut palms, and looked around. This was our new home. We were taken to Pavuva for a rest. Here we were to prepare for the next military campaign. Instead of the familiar machetes, we were given buckets and shovels. There were no thickets of tall grass and bushes to cut down, but everywhere, as far as the eye could see, was dirt, which had to be filled with tons of coral from an open pit on the hill directly in front of us. We shared Powee with hordes of rats, which also had to be dealt with in the traditional American way. Pretty soon our supply of poison was running low, and the piles of small carcasses in various stages of decomposition became more of a nuisance than the swarms of live rodents that made periodic raids on our tents. When darkness stopped our battles with mud and rats, the soft rustling of palm branches heralded the arrival of a more exotic foe, bats silently spreading their wings in the wind. In the end, we only managed to deal with the mud. We left the rats alone and tried not to disturb the bats, only sometimes wondering where the rats came from, and if from palm branches, as we assumed, how they got along with their silent neighbours. But the food was disgusting and the tents were rotten and holey. There was no drinking water either, unless you counted the amount that had accumulated in the helmets overnight. We bathed by jumping out naked into the rain, hastily soaping ourselves, as the rain could stop at any moment, and so there was a danger of remaining soaked indefinitely. We boiled our clothes in rainwater tanks. Our ulcerated feet ached mercilessly, and we often had to take off our boots and socks and lie down with our feet exposed to the sun. But we had endured it all before, and we could endure it now. Only bad food and holes in the tents could not affect the morale of my comrades. The loss of hope. That's what broke us. Hope for the approach of fresh units, the sunshine for victory, for survival. When we were told that we would not be sent home to replace our personnel, we stifled our hope and turned into wooden soldiers. We associated the future with countless enemy-occupied islands to be reclaimed, and we had long since noticed the dwindling number of veterans. Those we had been with in New River. After each operation, people considered the situation hopeless, and some even took their own lives. We'd lie there, listening to the sound of the rain or the stomping of rat paws, and think about nothing. And then everything changed. We were told that half of the veterans could go home. At first there was immense joy, and then, when the method of selecting the lucky ones was announced, equally immense anger. There would be a drawing of lots, a lottery in which pieces of paper with names would be pulled out of a hat, but only the names of those who had never been penalized would be written. I was among those whose names were not written on the coveted slips of paper, as were the names of Hohutun, Healthy, Chicken, Souvenir, and many others. It appeared that the veterans of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Division were divided into good guys and bad guys. We were all pissed off. Now I know how a convict feels when he is reminded of all his past sins. We ended up in the bad guy group precisely because of the past, and no one took into account that we'd already been punished, and more than once. We were used to solving all our problems by one method, choosing ship rats for especially dirty work and depriving them of their deserved privileges. And the fact that we performed well in combat did not change anything. Even worse must have been the members of the third group, who had occupations so rare that one could not do without them, regardless of whether they were good or bad soldiers. I suspect that any verdict against the artist would have been overturned simply because his work could not be done by anyone else. Without the artiste, there is no map department. Likewise, I have no doubt that someone in our command was committed to the theory that frequent occupants of the brig should take the fall for everything. Now, looking back, it is easy for me to forgive my commanders for such an attitude. But back then the situation was quite different. We felt unjustly sentenced to execution. The blatant injustice shocked me so much that I could hardly control myself, struggling to cope with the indignation. When, after the departure of the lucky ones, a period of stricter discipline ensued, I decided to get away from Pavuvu to a place where I could rest and regain my peace of mind. Is there any better place for that than a hospital? The episode with Lieutenant Big Kino showed that escaping to the hospital can solve a lot of problems. Why not try this method again? Because of the rain, which has been raining incessantly even though the rainy season seems to be over, my bedwetting has worsened. Perhaps the condition was aggravated by excitement. The guys living in the same tent with me had long insisted that I see a doctor, so I did. The doctor, who already knew me, gave me a referral to the hospital at Bannock. I was to leave early in the morning. Back from the infirmary, I walked with a sense of grim satisfaction. As I entered the tent, I saw Rutherford sitting on my bunk. Suddenly the palm trees and the tropical night disappeared, and I was back in front of the station square bank. Home. How often we stood there, Rutherford, me and the other guys, discussing the soccer team's game. He joined the Marines at the same time as me and ended up in the 5th Regiment. After New River, we didn't see each other again. He smiled happily, and I asked, "Why didn't they send you home?" Didn't turn out to be a very good fellow, I suppose." "Me neither," I said, and was silent for a moment when I saw him pull a large Japanese pistol out from under his jacket. "What the hell do you need that for?" He quickly looked away and shoved it under the blanket. "Save it for me, please. I stole it from the company commander today, and he's got the whole place on edge. He promises to have it searched, and it's mine by rights. That insolent captain took it from me, taking advantage of his position. I took it from a Japanese major at Talazea. He shot himself with Dan." Come on," I agreed. "Tomorrow I'm going to the hospital on Banika, and I'll take it with me." "That's great." His eyes sparkled with joy. "Let them search the whole fucking island. They won't find anything." Rutherford was certainly relieved. In the morning I secured Rutherford's gun under my arm with white tape, put on my jacket, took my bag of personal effects and went to the division hospital. From there a landing craft transported me to Banika. Banika was a luxurious place. Banika was a big city. Banika was Broadway. Banika had women's, steel and wood houses, roads, sailors, a movie theatre, electric lights and lots of candy stores, and of course there was beer on Banika. As I followed the others from the dock toward the naval hospital, I felt like a redneck who was in New York for the first time. Cars whizzed along the roads, raising almost forgotten puffs of dust. Crags hummed on the wharf loading and unloading ships. Military policemen patrolled along the high fence, behind which women, nurses and Red Cross workers scurried. Everyone was well-fed and relaxed. Truly, Banika was a gift from heaven. We, thin and restless, with dissatisfaction on our faces and nervous impatience in our hands, were quite out of place. As we walked down the street, I thought that it was probably the image of Baika, not Pavuvu, that would be presented to America as the symbol of the war in the Pacific. I remembered a singer I knew before the war who used to visit us in New River. She asked permission to meet me, and the two of us went for a walk around the empty base. "What do you think about it?" I asked. "Not too luxurious," she replied, obviously thinking of other bases she'd been to, shining with the showy gloss of polished metal, with comfortable houses and military balls. So Nayati's poor tents and wooden barracks didn't impress her. Pavuvu, like New River and all the other places we had to visit, was not too luxurious. But Banika, Banika, here every luxury was at your service. America will be told that this is what the war in the Pacific was like. An orderly led me into a ward and through it into a small cellar-side room. "No. Take off your clothes," he said coldly. tossing me a set of hospital garb. The job was clearly unpleasant for him. I began to undress. "Give me your belt and blades," he said. The order was rather strange, but I obeyed. As I continued to slowly undress, I looked around and found the window barred. A belt? Blades? The bars? Where the hell am I? The orderly intercepted my gaze and condescended to explain. "This is a temporary room. There's no room in the ward you need to be put in right now." I nodded, not believing him for a moment, and looked at the guy surreptitiously. The skin on his face was white and unweathered, an obvious sign of living in civilized conditions. He was very young and had probably just recently arrived from the States. And he had the mocking and slightly contemptuous look of a sailor who finds it humiliating to deal with land rats. And then I remembered that I had a Rutherford pistol under my arm. I undressed very slowly and waited until the orderly had had enough of the pole, took my belt and shaving gear, and turned toward the door to the temporary ward. That's when I shed the rest of my clothes, grabbed my gun, pointed it at my foe, and called out softly, "Hey, you!" He turned around irritably, saw the huge gun, and pointed at him and froze. I, in turn, remained silent and unmoving. It was very pleasant to see the expression of superiority disappear from his face, the way he licked his lips nervously. If I was in the psych ward, and since I was considered abnormal, I would play my part to the end and enjoy it. A naked psycho threatening a healthy cretin. What am I supposed to do about it? After a pause, I asked. He was too frightened to answer, so after waiting a little longer and enjoying my superiority to the fullest, I continued, "You had better take this and put it with my things." The orderly, silently and very carefully, took the gun and went out. Fool. He didn't even have the brains to check if the gun was loaded or not, and it wasn't. Dressed in faded pajamas and a red robe, I entered the room. The first patient I saw stopped me and asked, "I'm going to a party tonight and I just need to clear my mind. Would you mind holding them while I get dressed?" Now had no doubts left. Temporary ward. Sure. I didn't argue. Go ahead. He brought his hands to his head, folded his palms in a cup, and made a motion as if he were shifting something into my hands. Then he took a few steps to the side, came back with a handkerchief, took his brains, blurted out, "Thank you very much," and went out of the room into a small corridor, where he started waving the handkerchief, mumbling something under his nose. I watched him for a few minutes, waiting for him to get bored with the fooling around. But he didn't. He was a real, genuine lunatic. In the corner of the sun-drenched room were tables where patients could read, write letters, or play board games. There were two guys sitting there playing cards. I walked over and sat down next to them. After waiting a few minutes, I shook my head in the direction of the brain cleaner, and "What the hell is wrong with him?" "Psycho," they replied in unison, not taking their eyes off the game. Silence. I spoke again, but not too confident. "What kind of ward is this?" P38. They answered again, but now with undisguised irritation. As I understood it, this designation was for wards where many of the patients were sure they could fly. The players had stopped playing and were now scrutinizing me, as if waiting to see what I would do. I didn't please them, nor did I resent them, but just stood up and headed to the other end of the ward where a nurse was sitting in a glass cube. She looked so sterile, unfriendly and cold that I had not the slightest doubt that she would not lift a finger to help the sufferer. In hospitals, all the work was done by orderlies and the nurses kept the records. In the war in the Pacific, nurses in naval hospitals were not angels of mercy. No patient would ever call them that. They were more like accountants. They looked down on us from the height of their own grandeur, as if they were not nurses, but lieutenants looking contemptuously at the enlisted men. We always sent the haughty sisters to hell. They did nothing useful but bother the orderlies and annoy the patients. As I approached, a round-faced man was stomping around her, urging her to look at a pornographic picture given to him by some kindly man. Later I found out that this patient went crazy because of sex. By the way, a lot of people had similar problems. She pretended to admire what she saw and hurried away from the poor man. Then she looked up at me. There was so much cold contempt in her gaze that I decided to be amused again. "Mercies, sir," I said, staring at her intently. "Give me back my blades." "Why?" she asked. "I have a grudge against someone." She looked at me in mute amazement, but I was focused and serious. She wrote something down, as if she were writing a mortal sin in the Book of Judgments, and I retreated satisfied. Damn them all to hell. If they think I'm crazy, I'll be crazy. At least until I see a psychiatrist. I saw him the next day. He watched mockingly as I entered the office and sat across from him. What about the blades? What? It was a joke, sir. I know, he said reproachfully. But don't joke like that again, please. You've upset your sister. Yes, sir. It's hard enough not to vent your frustration when they put you in room P38 instead of someplace where there's at least a slightly better chance of curing weak kidneys. But I remained silent while Dr. Gentleness examined me, running a test with a mallet, somehow hitting a metal mallet just below a patient's kneecap while sitting cross-legged demonstrates the speed of reflexes. The doctor concentrated on the examination and I was able to watch him without interference, broad-shouldered. Strong. He was all broad, massive shoulders, arms, head, and you could feel the strength in his every movement. On the other hand, the softness of his manners and speech seemed almost feminine, and the impression of femininity was enhanced by the smooth movements and kindly expression of his face. But his gentleness was hardly to be counted on. Evidently, Dr. Gentleness had worked it out on purpose, so that the patient would relax and spout more than he wanted to. He began to ask questions, from which it was obvious that the doctor was a Freudian. Most of his questions and tests were about sex. He tried to find any anomaly. Then he questioned me at length about my childhood. 15 minutes later the interview was over, and as I continued to stare at the doctor with the intense scrutiny of a defendant awaiting a judge's verdict, he said, "Don't worry. You'll be here for about a month, at least. We'll probably have to see each other periodically. So relax and try to take things with humor. As far as I can tell, you're fine. Maybe a little too hot-headed, but—" "What do you mean?" I was deliberately surprised. He smiled, and I would have felt like a complete idiot if I hadn't seen the humor of the situation. I reminded myself of a man who, in a frenzy, runs back and forth and shouts. Who's worried? I had denied my temper all my life, and now I was relieved to admit it. Jody questioned me at length about the war. My story made him sigh and shake his head reproachfully several times. As far as I understood, he was convinced that not only me, but my entire division should be sent to a psychoanalyst. Then we talked a little about books. He was quite well-read and philosophy. Suddenly he stopped halfway through, and "What did you say you were there?" "A scout," I said proudly, "and a machine gunner. But this is no place for a man of your caliber." I was frankly shocked. Wasn't our government guilty of spoiling high IQ recruits, as if they were too smart to fight for their country? Didn't Dr. Gentle notice that I was proud of my position as a scout, and before that as a machine gunner? Keep it up, America. Explain to the younger generation that the filth and danger of war is only for the dumb and feeble-minded. Let them know that only fools are capable of self-sacrifice, that America should be defended by primitive men and enjoyed by high intellectuals. Keep exalting the head above the heart, and pretty soon the head will consider any fight a sin and will give all the treasure to the first bandit who has the guts to demand it. But Dr. Gentle did not seem to hear the flow of pride in my words, so I stammered and made a rather awkward joke, hoping to change the subject. By the way, he suddenly remembered. I have your gun. How would you feel about selling it to me? I'd like to send it home as a souvenir. I'm sorry, sir, I can't. It doesn't belong to me. No, too bad. He sighed and stood up. But if you change your mind, let me know. My family in Australia will be thrilled. He looked at me thoughtfully. There's not much we can do about your bedwetting. At night, an attendant will wake you up at regular intervals. You are not restricted from moving around the hospital like other patients. You can go to the movies and to the common dining room, and please, no more blade jokes. That night, the orderly woke me up every hour. The next night the same, then another. On the fourth night I was not disturbed, and the bedwetting hastened to prove that it had gone nowhere. They started waking me up again, then stopped without warning. The effect was the same. I understood perfectly well what the doctors were trying to accomplish. They just wanted to determine if I was really sick. There was too great a flow of fakers. Everyone was subjected to such treatment, so I didn't protest, and soon I stopped paying attention to minor inconveniences. Be that as it may, but life in Ward P38 was incomparably more pleasant than on Pavuvu. There were quite a few interesting, if not strange, things going on here. Perhaps the strangest was Captain Midnight. He would get up from his bunk, stretch his arms out to the sides like wings, arch his back and start running around the ward on tiptoe, raising and lowering his wings and tilting his body like an airplane, while humming monotonously. "Captain Midnight to the airfield," he shouted. "Captain Midnight to the airfield." The patients immediately joined in the game. Hey, Captain, be careful. You've got a 0 on your tail." "There's attention, Captain. Anti-aircraft guns." "Good work, Captain. You sent 0 to the dust." Private Child was behind the bars that separated us from the violent patients. I was very surprised to see him there. He looked at me timidly and asked for something sweet. I gave him some candy and could not help but notice his hands. After all, this was the same child who had strangled the Japanese man. He had short, broad hands of artistic power. I wondered, I thought, how this past deed had anything to do with his madness. Was it a punishment, a remorse, or was there no connection here? I asked the orderly about Dieter. He's gone to the limit," said the orderly. The guy had been to Pavuvu and knew what he was talking about. "Remember the road that goes around the island? There's always a little airplane parked there. Anyway, this guy went out on the road one day and climbed into the airplane. He was caught when he started the engine. When asked where he was going, he said, 'Home, I got to go home. I've got to get out of this hell.' After that, he was brought here. He was brought to Banika. It was certainly not the home he wanted to go to, but at least there was no war here, and he was bound to get home eventually. For Child, the war was over. He would go home and maybe regain his sanity. I wonder how much more I could take. Ever since I climbed over the side of the Higgins on Guadalcanal and saw the sprawling branches of the palm trees overhead, it was madness that I feared most. Anything, death, captivity, but not madness. But I'd always believed that madness came not from within, from the pressure of circumstances on the human brain, but from outside, from a bullet, a piece of shrapnel, a concussion. In other words, I considered its causes to be physical, not mental. In the mental ward, I realized I was wrong. I saw what despair can do to the human mind. I think of the manic-depressive patients. They are the real sons of despair. I've seen them. I've felt how oppressed their spirits are, and I couldn't imagine what could happen to a person to turn them into a silent ghost walking around the ward with clenched lips and empty eyes. Banika was paradise, of course, and as in any self-respecting paradise, there was a forbidden fruit, at least for enlisted men. Nursing. "It's nothing personal," explained the orderly who had told me the sad story of the child. "It's just that they're women, and women here can only bring bad luck. There is too much trouble from them." He paused and continued, "You know, when we arrived on Banika, there were no nurses here, just doctors and us." He side-pooled heavily. "It was a good time. The doctors always shared the liquor they got with us, and everything else too. We lived like one big family. The food was great, and the doctors never took offense. They never took advantage of us. We just did what we had to do. We got along great together." He sighed once more, and his face darkened visibly. "And then the nurses arrived, and everything changed at once. We became the bad guys. There was no more good booze, no more food, and no more friendly atmosphere. The nurses only talked to the doctors, and the doctors only talked to God. Trouble is, the work didn't get less, and it didn't get easier. More than that, it got harder and much harder. And look what the sisters have turned the base into. They've built a real fortification for them, now guarded by a battalion of military police. Imagine how ordinary guys like us feel when they see an officer rolling around in a jeep with a nurse. He's got a gun in his holster. What does that mean? It means he's going to defend that woman's honor from the rabble, which is us. We are the main enemies to be feared." His voice was ringing with resentment. "This is madness. This is wrong. It's unfair. Women have no business being here. If you can't send women here for everyone, let them all stay at home." The hospital had a decent library, and reading became my relaxation. I devoured 2 or 3 books a day, neglecting evening movie nights. Often, when the lights went out, I continued reading while sitting on the toilet. But finally, having satisfied my need to read, which at first seemed insatiable, I still went to the movies. A new feeling had awakened in my soul, something akin to shame. I began to be depressed by the idleness of my life in the hospital. I began to compare my penniless existence with the Spartan regime of my comrades at Pavuvu, and was surprised to feel contempt for myself. My protest against the unfair lottery had faded, and I was beginning to forget the true reasons for my escape to the hospital. The books bored me, and with them everything around me, so I decided to go to the movies. I joined a group of patients from Ward P38 who were accompanied there by an orderly. Our appearance aroused excitement and curious glances. How could it be that they had brought the lunatics? We took seats in the amphitheatre, hastily constructed from the logs of coconut palms. Soon the commandant of the island arrived and the movie began. It was soon interrupted. The public address system was activated, and a cheery voice announced, "Allied troops have landed in northern France. The second front is open." The night was filled with enthusiastic shouts, which subsided after a while, and the movie continued. I got up and left the amphitheatre, feeling my heart pounding hard. My excitement was hard to understand. There was undoubtedly an element of pride, but a sense of anxiety prevailed. It suddenly occurred to me that a great event had occurred. The war would now be moving rapidly toward a victorious spear, and I, wearing stupid pajamas and a robe, was holed up in the hospital. Suddenly such a longing came over me that I cried and hurried down the road to the hospital. I wanted to be together with my comrades. I did not have to wait long. I was called into Dr. Gentle's office. Next to him sat the chief of the hospital. I noticed Rutherford's gun on the table and realized that I wouldn't be staying at Bannock for long. "There's not much we can do for you here on the island," the hospital director said. "We don't have the facilities to treat you. All you need is a change of climate and rest." "You mean they'll send me back to the States, sir?" I asked. He grinned sadly. "That's usually what we do. Unfortunately, it's not that simple with you Marines. So we're going to put you back in your company and suggest that your commanding officer assign a sentry to wake you up at night." I laughed. So did he. And Dr. Gentle was not far behind us. There was no bitterness or reproach in that laugh, because they knew as well as I did that it was impossible. One could only pity the sentry, who would be foolhardy enough to grope his way through the tents at night, taking care of his comrade's full bladder. It's going to be bad for the poor guy. "Don't forget your gun," said Dr. Gentle. "Sure you don't want to sell it?" "Sorry, sir, no. I told you that thing doesn't belong to me, and thank you for everything." He nodded, and I left the office. I left P38 with a light heart and took the first boat I could find to Pavuvu. Pavuvu was lively. I felt it the moment I stepped ashore. The first thing I saw was people swimming in the bay. There were at least 100 of them, laughing carefree, jumping and frolicking in the clear water like merry dolphins. Their strong bodies glistened in the sun, and their bronze tan seemed even darker against the foyer of white underwear. This was evident in the immaculate cleanliness of the tents that stood in rows between the palm trees, in the neatness of the streets laid out between them, bounded by coconuts stuck in the ground, in the busyness of the traffic on the island's only road. There were real toilets, showers and volleyball courts. There was an outdoor movie theatre and even laundry facilities. But most importantly, the spirit of the Marines, their unwavering confidence, was renewed. This change was as sudden and inexplicable as a change in the wind. The grim men scolded, then began to joke, and before the first burst of laughter could subside, the change had taken place. People began to watch their clothes, shave more often, some even found brooms and swept their tents. When someone got a crate and made a camp chest out of it, everyone immediately wanted one. The fashion became universal. All the infantrymen scattered around the island in search of unwanted crates or at least good boards. When the division headquarters sent balls, immediately in all units, the platoons, squads, companies, began to organize basketball and volleyball teams, which competed with each other, indulging in this activity with all the passion. In short, the fighting spirit of the Marines was reborn again, and it was flying proudly like a banner in the wind of pride and glory. So, returning to the island, I found a very different environment from that which had existed before my hasty escape, and what is equally, if not more important, I found a new friend. The schoolboy had just arrived on the island from the States. As my boat approached the shore, the newcomers were just being led to the tents. As they entered the tents, they replaced their clean, new camouflage uniforms with veterans' clothes that had faded in the southern sun, salted clothes that had been in combat more than once. It was believed that new recruits who had not been shot would feel more confident in the old guard uniforms. The veterans had no such psychological problems, and they quickly sensed a gold mine. Only a few days passed, and the old men, previously distinguished by their shabby clothes, could be recognized by their luxurious new uniforms. I was sitting in the tent, watching with pleasure, when suddenly my view was obscured by a bulky duffel bag being pushed into the tent by a sweating newcomer. "Is this the tent of the reconnaissance party?" A little timidly, he asked. "Yeah, come on in," I replied, eyeing the impressive load with interest. I broke the chocolate bar I'd brought from Baniki in half and handed him half. "Make yourself comfortable. Would you like some chocolate?" He grabbed his half quickly, as if he was afraid I'd change my mind, and started chewing quickly. "No, thank you," he mumbled with his mouth full. "We hadn't eaten since we got ashore this morning." "Hey, what do you got there?" I asked, pointing to the bulky load. "Any shoes?" I desperately needed at least some shoes, but looking at the newcomer's feet, I sighed disappointedly. "What size are you?" "Hey, where did you get the books in here?" "My dad sent them." "Great," he proclaimed excitedly. "I have some books with me, too. Can I put them with yours?" Go ahead," I said, and freed a shelf for his books and a place in my heart for him. It wasn't just books. I remember he had with him Jean Christophe by Romain Rolland and something by Calderon in Spanish. 51 felt a strong will in him, and I liked very much the stubborn expression of his slightly mocking face. So we became friends and remain so to this day. After Chicolier, 4 more newcomers arrived in our group. 2 of them were yesterday's high school students, each about 18 years old, one a bully, the other obedient, the first coming from somewhere in the Midwest, the other a southerner. The bully was quite aggressive and very bright. The submissive was timid and slow. Very different, they were inseparable and soon became the twins. The third newcomer to our group was White Man. A native of the hills of Virginia, he was a racist to the bone, from the tips of his fingers to the top of his narrow, long, russet-haired head. He once told me that after the war he would be busy cleansing his land of niggers, and when that was done he and his associates would take on the Catholics. At this there was an explosion of laughter in the tent, for only a bigot utterly devoid of a sense of humour could take offence at the white man's naive hostility. He was the first recruit I had ever seen. The corps was now accepting recruits into its ranks. Not many, but enough to shake our privileged position as an elite. The only time the white man managed to antagonize us was when he spoke disrespectfully of the volunteers. He smugly said that all the volunteers are morons because they volunteered to come here. He was not such a fool. He waited until they came for him. Our silence expressed our contempt for the ignoramus. Dirty Fred, the fourth newcomer, was a lean, nosy, and quiet country boy from Kansas who knew all about the mysteries of the barnyard and had the attitude of a cocky rooster. He liked to apply barnyard standards to human interactions and was not just boring, but rather even insufferable, often provoking the anger and loud indignation of the not-so-squeamish Marines. After the arrival of the replenishment, life on Pavuvu had changed. The emphasis was now on training, aimed at getting the new men to fit into the division. Many veterans, however, were reluctant to be associated with the monotonous routine of training again and had taken care of sanikyas in advance to justify their absence. And some, like Artist, simply stayed away. The artist, like Achilles, languished gloomily in his tent. It often happened that in the morning, at 10 o'clock, when I had already finished my work with the battalion censor, Lieutenant Liberal, which consisted in licking and sealing envelopes, I would go to Artist's tent and bring a few slices of bread from the galley. The artist would open a tin of the tasty canned food his mother regularly supplied him with. I would boil some coffee, and we would have a feast. We drank coffee in the evenings. After the movies, no one would pass by the pot of coffee I made. Warmed by the black liquid, the guys had leisurely conversations, arguing and joking, comparing the coffee made by me and the coffee offered by the sergeant in charge of the housekeeping department. I was ungodly flattered. This is the best coffee on Pavu, but I think they came to my tent not for the coffee, but for the conversation. My kitchen was no match for that of the sergeant-intendant. He made coffee on an acetylene burner, and I had to use an old tin can suspended over a tomato paste can filled with gasoline. Let's just say the sergeant had taste on his side and I had atmosphere on mine. The books that belonged to me and Chicolier, especially the dictionary and the yearbook, turned our tent into a meeting place for the literary beaumont. A kind of tradition became a dispute with Eloquent, who readily entered into a verbal duel with any opponent. Besides, it seemed very attractive to accept a cup of coffee from the hands of an Asian. It was a term with a mixture of respect and fear for someone who had been in the tropics too long. I learned from Eloquent how to use this definition, which placed a person in the category of untouchable, uncriticized, automatically exempt from all dirty work and such daily hassles as waking up and morning exercises. My 4-week stay in Ward P38 on Bannock made me doubly Asian. In my case, it was an official title, so no one minded when I went out every morning to seal envelopes with Lieutenant Liberal, thus avoiding other duties, or when I walked around dressed only in loafers and a towel wrapped around my hips. Officers would shrug their shoulders, shake their heads, and call me Asian. A person considered different from others always attracts special interest. My reputation led to the fact that every evening, when I finished typing letters on a crumbling typewriter I'd bought on occasion for $10, my tent was packed with guys returning from the movies who wanted to get a cup of coffee and enjoy a fierce discussion between two Asians, me and Eloquent. Occasionally a bottle of whiskey would come to us in one way or another, either bought at an ungodly price or, as it happened once, extorted by outright blackmail from Lieutenant Liberal. He had decided that the soldiers of the reconnaissance party should be on guard duty with the rest of us, and had rashly said that he himself was a staunch advocate of equality, so he had to extend his principles to his liquor ration. If, by all accounts, the whiskey ran out too quickly, I brought a flask of jungle juice from Crestfallen's tent. If even that wasn't enough, we drank aftershave or hair topicals. Once I grabbed some horrible green stuff called Dupré, and when I woke up in the morning I had the distinct feeling that my tongue had been shaved and then shampooed. If we had not only coffee but also alcohol, we often took to singing. Our repertoire was mostly Blatt songs or World War I songs. Once we even fell so low in spirits that we began to chorus classical compositions. The 4 ended with a gloomy piece of our own composition, which was prompted by the news that the division was ready to go into battle again. 3 to the tune of Funiculi Funiculi, we sang a hideous serenade. Surrounding one guy or another, we'd drag it. Yo-ho, yo-ho, Playboy's about to die. Yo-ho, yo-ho, Playboy's about to die. He's gonna die, he's gonna die, he's gonna die, he's gonna die, he's gonna die. Then what the hell? You're gonna die anyway. We sang it to everyone but Liberal, artist, and white man. Rumour has it the next campaign will be short. It won't be like the ones on Guadalcanal and New Britain. It will be violent and really fast-paced. And then the old ones will go home. Our spirits were high. Rutherford had regained his gun. He came for it late at night, when everyone was at the movies and I was alone in the tent typing a letter by the dim light of a wick made from a piece of rope dipped in a can of gasoline. Rutherford and his companion came out of the darkness, observing all the rules of conspiracy. I was glad to be rid of that toy, for I was always afraid it would be stolen from me. "See you at home," said Rutherford, and slipped back into the night. We left Pavuva. Winners of the Guadalcanal and New Britain campaigns, we were once again walking into the open mouths of the landing ships that were to take us to war. Never before had we been so sure of victory, and never again would its Zipa be so high. On Pellew the slaughter was going on. The island, to be flat and featureless, was the altar on which 1,700 men were to be sacrificed. Army and Navy aircraft had already ploughed the island thoroughly. Before our arrival, an armada of heavy cruisers and battleships had approached Pellew and bombarded the coral fortress for days. The little atoll, about 8 kilometres long and about 3 wide, and in the widest part, was hidden by a cloud of black smoke. This gloomy cloud was in some places pinkened by the flames of fires, and at times shook and glittered like a neon advertisement. The rumble of heavy shell bursts echoed over the water for miles. Our landing craft spit out our floating track transporters a half-mile from shore. We rolled out of its belly like the ugly offspring of the Martian monster, and immediately found ourselves in the midst of a nightmarish cacophony of sounds, rumbling, whistling, roaring, hissing, crackling. All in all, it seemed as if we were witnessing the total destruction of a small island. Giant warships bobbed gently on the water behind us, and ahead of us was the enemy. The airplanes overhead were ours alone. It was a moment of supreme confidence, of banishing the fear of death. I looked back at the scene of conquest. Heavy shells were whistling toward the shore above our heads. Those of us who had been on Guadalcanal remembered how hard it had been for us during the shelling from the sea, and in our hearts we sympathized with the enemy. Now that the war had taken a different direction, we could afford some generosity. The graceful destroyers and missile ships moved gracefully like thoroughbred horses. When the missile ships fired their deadly salvos, there was a monstrous rumble, and the sky above them turned dark. Now the great madness was gradually waning. The curtain of fire was rising. Overwhelmed with rapturous excitement, I looked back to see our landing craft once more. The deck was crowded with sailors, some waving at us, others shaking their fists in Pelliu's direction, like spectators watching a gladiatorial spectacle, and suddenly somehow there was silence at once. The engines of the transporters roared, and we moved toward the cloud of smoke. I raised my head a little above the planking, as I was on the machine gunner's seat. In the next transporter, Big Guy was in the same position. He noticed me looking at him, nodded toward the island, and grinned. I realized what he meant and made the gesture that was supposed to mean everything was going right. "Damn it!" I shouted into the wind and noise. The Big Guy grinned once more, in complete agreement with me. Just at that moment there was a strange thump against the steel side of our watercraft, followed by a crushing sound. The air was filled with the crackle of tearing steel, and here and there fountains and geysers of water appeared. The enemy welcomed us. We were met with mortar and artillery fire. 10,000 Japanese, 10,000 brave, determined and skillful fighters were waiting for us on the island of Pelliu. Yes, skillful. A terrible rain was falling, and while we reached the shore, it did a lot of work on us. At the first explosion, Big Boy and I quickly ducked under the planking, and I didn't venture out again until we were about 30 meters from the shore. Our transporter was in the first wave of the advance, and yet the shore was already covered with broken and burning transporters, bodies of wounded and dead. The white sand was riddled with deep craters that looked green from the outside. Camouflage-clad Marines were hiding in them. We stopped. Along with Lieutenant Longbox of Company F, to whom I was assigned along with Dirty Fred and the obedient twin, I jumped over the side of our watercraft and quickly dug a hole for myself. Behind me a shell exploded. The blast wave threw a nearby man to one side and his feet in high, laced boots designed for jungle walking to the other. It was a fellow with whom we had been on the New Britain together and who, when the Japanese came up behind me, fired over my head. I think he was alive, but the war was over for him. Lieutenant Longbox tried to say something, but I couldn't hear anything and signaled him to write whatever he wanted. He shrugged and waved it off. Nothing important then. At that time, another Marine appeared up ahead. His face was contorted with fear. He was clutching with one hand the other, where the tip of his index finger had been shot off, the stump as bright as a Roman candle. This was the corporal who had earned Hohotun's dislike on Guadalcanal the night of the Battle of Tiparu. Then our machine gun, placed by him, flopped in the mud. I think his face, in addition to fear, showed delight and relief. We could not move, but it was not only the mortars that were to blame. On a coral cliff protruding into the sea, the Japanese had set up a firing point from which they poured machine gun fire on the shore. We found a hole in the cliff. Obviously, it was the entrance to their cave, and pelted it with grenades and dynamite, burning everything inside with flamethrowers. And yet the fierce fire did not cease. Looking around, I saw that along the shore stretched thickets of bushes, behind which was located the desired-for-us airfield and the main fortifications of the enemy, which we later called the Ridge of Devil's Nose. In the shrubbery I noticed a yellow butterfly flitting among the green branches. Something else was moving in the distance, which turned out to be a tank. Our tank. There was a temporary lull, and I heard excited shouts as the tank burst into position against the coral fortress that held us in place. One after another it fired shells into the hole. Its machine gunner shot a whole sliver. But by some miracle the enemy firing point remained unharmed and continued to fire. And then a strange action began. A Japanese soldier suddenly appeared in the hole. His figure blocked the passage for a moment and then immediately disappeared from view. He was followed by another, and another, and another. Every appearance of the enemy drew a frantic fire from every kind of weapon we had. It was as if we were firing at rabbits. They appeared instantly and stealthily, like rodents, and just as quickly disappeared, as if the fortress were a large cage. By the way, it was almost so, because the Japanese spent a lot of time on Pelliu and managed to equip a whole network of caves inside the coral. So when the Japanese jumped out, They simply moved to another position, perhaps even crawling under us in the process. Only one of the island defenders jumping out of the cave died. He was fat and clumsy, and his shirt and pants were stuffed with rice, like the poor guy who went to feed the crocodiles on Guadalcanal. He moved slowly, and bullets hitting him dislodged fountains of blood and rice. It was hot. The white sand burned his body through his clothes. It was the enveloping, relaxing warmth of the steam room. Sweat dripped down our faces and into our mouths, increasing our thirst. The water in our flasks became hot. After drinking it all, I filled my flask again with dirty rainwater that had accumulated in one of the sinks. There was no fresh water on Peleliu. The Japanese had collected rainwater in open cisterns, but ours had brought it to the island in drums that always carried gasoline, and some idiot in the supply department hadn't cleaned them of fuel residue beforehand. It was impossible to drink the water, which had the taste and smell of gasoline. The merciless sun was beating down when we, encouraged by the cessation of fire from the coral fortress, crawled out of our hiding places and headed through the bushes to the airfield. Before the runway began near the bush itself, we found a large crater from a heavy shell and took up positions in it. Here I met the artiste. Liberal is dead, he reported. The mine got him and the soldier. And the soldier. What about him? He lost his legs but not his spirit. The war is over for him. Yeah, too bad about Liberal. He wasn't a bad guy. Shrapnel hit him in the stomach. I saw him leaning against a tree, smiling. I asked if he needed anything, but he said he was fine. He died that way, sitting by the tree. The artist shook his head and walked away. Wow, how unlucky for Liberal. I pity his fine education, his unfailing sense of humour, and the kind smile on his pleasant, intelligent face. All of that had disappeared, leaked out through some crack in the vessel of life while the man sat leaning back against the tree, smiling and making plans for the future, which were quite realistic, thanks to the Allied victories and his own temporary disablement due to injury. And now he's gone. May he rest in peace. We were left in a crater. The offensive was halted. There were rumours of our heavy losses. The island's defenders were determined and tenacious. The Marines began exploring loopholes in the coral in the airfield area. At noon I decided to eat, but I couldn't swallow a single spoonful of beans from my rations. I never ate anything on Peleliu. Their tanks appeared suddenly. They raced, crushing everything in their path across the airfield. The sight was frightening. They came out of nowhere, and on our side they were opposed only by Marines armed with rifles and machine guns. Ready fire began. I cautiously peered out of the funnel. Through the lace of bushes I saw a moving enemy tank, snipers in camouflage. I looked around for a moment but managed to spot an infantryman from Company F, a veteran who had clearly lost his head from fear. He was rushing to the rear, not recognizing the road, and clasping his hands, shouted, "Tank!" The officer who jumped out to meet him stopped the panic-stricken man and turned him 180 degrees and kicked him roughly, sending him back to his post. And we in the funnel prepared for defense, feeling like caravanners before the Indian attack. Enemy tanks passed by small wheels spun in the tracks. Machine guns crackled, bazookas thumped, our airplanes roared in the sky, dropping bombs on enemy tanks. Once a torpedo bomber flew over our heads. It went so low that, in my opinion, by pure chance, did not hit the coral with his belly. On our right, our tanks were advancing. They were moving forward, but every time they spit out another shell, they seemed to freeze in immobility. And then it was over. The Japanese tanks were destroyed. I climbed out of the funnel and went to the airfield. 20 meters away, a tank was burning. Inside it remained dead Japanese. Enemy snipers were hanging in their cradles like dolls put in a Christmas stocking. I took another step and almost stepped on someone's arm. Already opening my mouth to apologize, I saw that the hand didn't belong to anyone. It wasn't part of a body. It was lying on its own, palm up, clean, strong. I froze, unable to take my eyes off her. The hands are the master of the soul. They are the second part of the human trinity, head, hands, and heart. There is nothing more expressive, more beautiful in man than hands. It was unbearable to see this hand lying alone in the dust, as if scornfully cast away and no longer a part of the human body. It was the epitome of the senselessness of war, the primitive savagery of our own machinery of destruction. Humans were pitted against each other, killing each other, tearing each other's insides apart with their claws, driven by the manic rage of hypertrophied pride. The sight was extremely upsetting to me, and I paid my last respects to the hand torn from the human body with a respectful inclination of my head. Then I decided to move on, but I should have looked around beforehand. On the opposite side of the airfield I saw other tanks, around which lay corpses. Souvenir was trotting among them, armed as always with a flashlight and pliers. His wavy moustache poked up in anticipation of rich booty. This was Souvenir's last plundering foray into the mouths of dead enemies. An hour later he was killed during an assault on enemy positions. Lieutenant Commando was killed in the same sortie. May they rest in peace? Our casualties were very high. By the end of the day, in the 1st Regiment they amounted to about 500 men, that is, about 20%. And that's just on the first day. We were advancing again. Our objective was the Chateau-Vanosa Ridge. It was a height, clearly visible from the airfield. Being on it, the enemy had every advantage, moving on the flat surface of the coral reef, on which there was not a single hollow or other natural shelter. We were as visible to the Japanese who were huddled on the height as clay ducks in a shooting gallery, but there was no other way, and we had to overcome it. Machine guns rained bullets on the airfield. Mortar shells rained down with the calm regularity of a machine gun. It seemed that the Japanese had calculated at what density of fire would kill most of ours, and now methodically and leisurely did their work, quite satisfied with the result. The Marines were falling. They ducked and staggered forward. They fell to their knees and got up again. They were thrown back by explosions, but they rose and stubbornly strove forward. The offensive continued. The day was dying away, dwarfed by hoarse cries for help. An empty transporter from another unit had mistakenly entered our sector. Noticing it, Lieutenant Rissak jumped aboard and ordered the driver to move toward the front line. He wanted to take out the wounded. But the driver did not seek the laurels of a hero and was in no hurry to obey. He was from another unit. He was tired and saw no reason to obey an unfamiliar officer. He replied that he could not obey the order. The trotter stated that he had better obey after all. The driver then refused outright. Trotter drew his pistol, pressed the barrel against the driver's head, and politely asked him to hurry up and send his ass to where he was ordered to go. The driver immediately forgot all his arguments and pointed the transporter in the direction indicated. Trotter received the Navy Cross for bravery shown on Guadalcanal. For bravery at Peleliu he was awarded another, unfortunately posthumously. He died during an attack on a long-range enemy firing point. May he rest in peace. It was getting dark, but the first day of the battle was still going on. We moved back to reinforce the positions we'd captured. Together with Dirty Fred, we set up in a deep crater. I tried to force myself to eat again, but was unsuccessful. The tension was so intense that my stomach flatly rejected any food. There was no more water at the bottom of the funnel, so I had to crawl out and go to the shore to look for it. Perhaps we had fresh water delivered to replace the tainted water mixed with gasoline that had made too many people sick. I made my way cautiously through the shrubbery. Runner emerged from the darkness on the other side. "Oh, the chicken's dead," he reported. Fool pulled out the needle the orderly had stuck in his arm to inject the plasma. You know how he was. Stubborn as I don't know what. He shook his head. Of course, maybe he would have died anyway. It had got... But he didn't want to even try to help himself. What a fool. The runner looked at me carefully through the darkness. It seemed to me that he had distinguished himself in some way that day, and now he was fighting the urge to tell me. Well, you know, it was a really big mess today, he began excitedly. Ask Hohotun, he won't lie. On Guadalcanal, compared to today, we were just drinking liquid tea. The fighting was tough, and we were told it would be easy here. You should have seen what happened when the tanks came at us. We stopped them with only machine guns and hand grenades. There was a note of triumph in Runner's voice. And how are the others? They're fine. Chuckles and Biggie are fine. The gentleman was wounded, but not badly. Lucky bastard. When he'd finished talking, he looked at me again. How are your boys? I told him about Liberal and the others, and his face darkened. There won't be many of us left after this one. By the way, did you notice that only the veterans are here? I nodded silently. I asked him if he had found water, but he tipped his flask upside down instead of answering. We walked back, each of us thinking about our own things. Do you remember, began Runner, the boys who made it as far back as Guadalcanal? We thought then that they were all pathetic weaklings who gave up so soon. But they're happier than you and me. They didn't have to go through all that shit. Maybe. I didn't argue, but they've never been to Melbourne. That's true too. But you know, Melbourne's the last thing on my mind right now. I've even begun to pray a lot, though I've never considered myself a very religious man. I had never seen Runner so serious. I remembered Father Integrity baptizing him at Pavuvu. He was very different then. Everything was different then. Guadalcanal was in the past, and with it the pagan naivete of the first battle. How much easier it would have been to become pagan again and refuse to take things seriously. We said our goodbyes at the edge of the funnel. How I had missed my friends. It was quite dark, and judging by the sounds that filled the night, the battle had resumed. Rifle and machine gun shots were heard here and there in the positions. Suddenly I realized that shots and bursts could also sound in different ways. Now they sounded like angry protests, as if the Marines were resenting the intrusion of night intruders, the way farmers chase poachers off their property. Even the darkness receded as ours began to use flares and bombs. The exact same ones illuminated our second night on Guadalcanal. Only then they were dropped over the jungle roof. Green, impenetrable, gloomy. Then rockets flew over our heads, emitting an ominous hissing sound. One would not envy those on whose head they would fall. Someone in the crater suggested that the Japanese had made a hole in our positions and the rockets were needed to plug the hole with steel. I tried to snatch a moment and at least take a nap, lying back and covering my face with my helmet, but it was impossible. The night turned into a nightmare of waking up. We met the morning with dry mouths, cracked lips, and hungry bellies. The heat was increasing very rapidly, scorching the rocky surface of the island and making the air as hot as the breath of the devil. "Let's go," said Lieutenant Longbox. "Yes, sir," I replied, and told Dirty Fred and Twin to get ready. We climbed out of the funnel and headed for a gap in the brush to our left, through which we could see the airfield. It was early morning. We passed 2 Marines sleeping soundly in their foxholes. I bent down to wake them up. "Hey," I shouted and shook one of them by the shoulder. "Wake up. It's time. We're getting off the ground." He not only didn't answer, he didn't react at all to my words. Then I turned him over. He was dead, with a hole in his head like that. It's impossible to stay alive. His comrade too. Through a gap in the shrubbery, I could see that F Company was attacking again. In the bushes stood Artist and watched the development of events. The mortars had fallen silent. The first wave of Marines moved along the runway. They ran, scattered and low-crouched, under longitudinal machine gun fire. They were running and falling. None of this could be happening in reality. The spectacle seemed a living picture, a nightmarish, delirious phantasmagoria, a scene from a movie that one did not want to watch. It took a certain effort to make myself believe that the Marines in front of us were alive. Real Marines, creatures of flesh and blood, men I knew well whose lives were connected to mine. An even greater effort was needed to realize that my turn was next. There had come a point in the battle when there was an urgent need for a unifying slogan, a battle cry. A banner or a song must now blaze over the army. The enemy must be openly challenged in the face. That's the way wars have always been fought. So the soldiers were raised to the attack, which either crushed the defence and baked victory, or choked and brought defeat. How much less repulsive the road to death might seem if I were ready to embark on it, if something irrational like "Long live the Emperor," or "Marines forever," were to sound. Instead, the soft voice of an educated man somehow mundanely said, "Well, now it's our turn." I said goodbye to the Artist. He looked at me sadly from under his helmet. His face became even darker and more angular, then cast a glance in the direction of the airfield, where people were still running and falling, and with pain in his voice, "Good luck to you, lad." Then he turned away quickly and strode away. I ran. The heat rose in stifling waves. Bullets whistled past, then flew silently by. I ran with my head down low, my helmet doing some crazy dance, occasionally falling over my eyes and blocking my view. At times I lost sight of Lieutenant Longbox and Dirty Fred. And then it seemed as if I were alone and still running. To my left, people were running and falling. I ran a few more steps, threw myself on the ground, regained my breath and ran again. Suddenly there was a funnel filled with people in my path, into which I fell, and only then did I stop running. The funnel was like an oasis in the desert. I was sure there were no shelters on the airfield grounds, and suddenly I stumbled upon one. It was much smaller than the one hidden in the bushes where I spent the night, but still its size allowed a dozen people to take shelter. 4 of them were from the 5th Marine Regiment, with a wounded lieutenant among them. The rest were from my battalion, including the F Company commander, Captain Dreadnought. They silently squeezed in to make room for me, and then I realized, and this knowledge came to me like the impact of an enemy shell, that I was not only in the only shelter on the airfield, but in the only conspicuous part of the airfield that enemy soldiers could see and fire upon. Inside of the enemy fortified area, a cement and steel blockhouse and several barracks. The funnel was under fierce machine gun fire. Heavier shells were also flying from there. As far as I understood, one thing saved us from total annihilation. The Japanese, who were firing from guns removed from the ships, could not hit our shelter accurately. They could neither lower nor raise the barrel, nor aim the sight so that the shell landed exactly in the center of our group. With a regularity worthy of better use, and with a precision that made our insides clench with fear, shells fell in front of the crater, behind it, on the sides. Sometimes a shell fell a little closer. Then we had to crumple on the bottom to avoid being hit by shrapnel, sometimes a little farther away. That one was pretty close, someone muttered, after we were literally deafened by the rumble of the explosion. That's right, another voice replied. So far, so good. Shut up. Captain Dreadnought shouted angrily. See if you can get this thing to work, he said, turning to the guy with the walkie-talkie. I need to contact the battalion. The walkie-talkie sat down in front of me, slouched down and asked me to start spinning certain discs. I complied with everything he said, but it didn't work. Then came the whistle of an approaching projectile. I tensed up, even though I knew I shouldn't be afraid of the projectile that could be heard. But it was useless to be afraid of the one that would get you, that is, the one you couldn't hear. Another voice was heard. A wounded lieutenant from the 5th Regiment. It turned out later that he wasn't just wounded, he was dying, was talking to his commanding officer over the walkie-talkie. The valiant Marines of the 5th Regiment have broken through, sir, he reported in a weak voice, and have made excellent progress. We have accomplished our objective and have rejoined the 1st Regiment. I looked at the lieutenant carefully. A neat, athletic, well-developed boy, probably from West Point or Annapolis. He was in a lot of pain, and his impassive face was already contorted with an agonizing grimace, though he was careful to hide it. A shell again, and we ducked. It exploded very close to us, showering us all with dirt and shards of coral. Perhaps no shell had ever come closer than that. Where's the fire coming from? Shouted Captain Dreadnought. The boys looked at each other and shrugged. What the hell? The captain raised his voice again. Let me through there. He crawled over to the machine gun mounted on the edge of the crater and carefully lifted his head. He carefully examined the fortified area and the Devil's Nose ridge to his left. Then he returned to the bottom of the funnel, retrieved the map and made a mark on it with a pencil. Try to contact the battalion again. He commanded. This time the contact was established. Hello, battalion, this is Fox Company. Enemy artillery at 128 George. We need fire support. Over and out. Unbelievable. Captain Dreadnought had no more idea of the location of the enemy gun than he did of the shape of the Japanese commander's nose. When he lifted his head over the edge of the crater and cast a hurried glance around, all he could see was the shot-up Devil's Nose ridge. Even assuming he had seen a puff of smoke, which he hadn't, it was impossible to determine its exact location, much less correlate it to a map. The coordinates he had reported to the battalion were frankly taken from the ceiling. But nevertheless, he had reason to expect the results of the fire support, because the chance that he had accidentally guessed the right spot was as great as that he had called fire on the Japanese general's muzzle. A few minutes later, I heard the shelling of 128 George begin. I looked at the sunburned, tense face and wondered why he wasn't too concerned about the shells falling around our shelter. When he spoke, however, I realized that his stupidity was matched by his bravery. How many men from the 1st Regiment are here? He asked. We raised our hands. 6 men? Well, I think that's enough. We'd better take this blockhouse. The machine gunners are holed up in there, so as soon as the artillery fire stops, let's go. That's it. No more and no less. The blockhouse withstood the fire from the sea without damage. It withstood direct bombardment. It's obvious that it was defended by a number of long-range gun emplacements. and the 6 of us are going to go in and take it. Captain Dreadnought may have been an arse, but no one could blame him for lack of courage. Personally, I didn't want to die for nothing. I glanced furtively at the boys of the 5th Regiment. They were looking at us with frank amazement, and I was desperately jealous of them, since they had all maintained diplomatic relations with common sense. Their commander had one foot on the other side of the world, but he could still hear everything. He waved at us and smiled weakly, as if to say, of course you won't succeed, but there's no harm in trying. Well, of course, there was certainly no harm to a dying man. It was quiet for a few minutes. The enemy fire ceased, as if to reinforce Captain Dreadnought's belief in his own power. We crawled out of the funnel and lined up behind the tank, moving toward the blockhouse. But now the tank was under fire, and shells began to fall around us again. The air was buzzing with invisible deadly shrapnel. It was unwise to stay close to this clanking behemoth. But at that very moment the tank commander apparently decided that it was unwise to remain such an attractive target, and drove his mechanical behemoth toward the right flank. Cells drove us into the funnel again, and Woki-Toki had another insurmountable difficulty with his equipment. Now he could receive, but he couldn't transmit. Battalion kept asking for coordinates. "You should go back to the CP and report," said the Capital Dreadnought, turning to me. "Just come back quickly." I climbed out of the funnel and dashed toward the bush. When I reached the CP, the artillery fire intensified. The furious shelling continued for about a minute, then stopped. I found Peace Major sitting hugging his satchel. A look of disgust froze on his round face. A meter away from him sat the guy who worked with the Woki-Toki and Eloquent, who had inherited my position as battalion clerk. I gave our coordinates and sat down to take a little break. And "How's it going, Lucky?" Major asked. "Not good, sir." I had nothing more to add, for my view of the battle was still a mad mix of people, movement, and explosions, which somehow involved the blazing airfield as well. I smoked in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the lacy shade of the shrubbery, then stood up and said, "I'd better get back." "Good luck to you." The Major nodded and turned away. I moved back, keeping to the right flank, because the artillery was talking again. On the way I noticed a Japanese rifle bayoneted into the ground. It was odd. I moved closer to examine the find. Perhaps it was a trap. I got pretty close, but I didn't have time to satisfy my curiosity, because I heard a distinctive sound and a bullet whizzed past. Another one. This time the bullet kicked up a column of dust under my feet. "Get out of here, you idiot," I told myself. "It's clearly a sniper's trap. He's aiming for the rifle. He's got a lot of nerve, though. The bastard, he almost got into our CP." I approached the ammunition depot on the edge of the airfield. 2 medics were carrying a wounded man on a stretcher. A bullet had hit the guy in the shoulder, and blood was gushing from the laceration. He was in high spirits, laughing and looking defiantly at the orderlies, as if to say, "I've already gotten mine. But how are you going to get out of this shit?" I grabbed my assault rifle, adjusted my clipboard, and carefully walked around the pile of shell casings to return to the crater. It was my last belligerent step. For the last time I turned my face to the enemy. A shell exploded 100 meters in front of me. I ducked to the right. Another explosion right in front of me. I ducked further to the right. Another explosion, and another, but much closer. 4 more, and 1 more right next to me. I stopped. A terrible fact was obvious. I had foolishly gotten between the enemy artillery position and its target. Perhaps the ammunition depot I had just passed was its target. At any rate, it was firing in that direction. There was nowhere to hide. To go forward would mean certain death. The only way out was to run without looking back, hoping to get out of the fire before a shell or shrapnel hit. I turned and ran. I ran, and the heat rose in waves from the hot coral. Sweat trickled down my body, greasing my joints, and fear instantly dried my mouth. The shells were catching up with me. They exploded behind my back, and the air was filled with the angry voices of shrapnel demanding my life. I ran, thinking of the Japanese artilleryman lurking on the ridge who was carefully aiming at me, and each shell he fired fell closer and closer to me, trying to catch his victim in this deadly game of cat and mouse. A shell fell 1.5 meters away from me, but it didn't explode, at least I think so. At times like this, you can't be sure of anything. When you are gripped by a wild, primal fear, time and space become different. But there was a projectile. A 1/2 meter high, red-hot ball struck the coral surface, bounced off, and flew away. I gathered the rest of my strength, and just at that moment a Japanese gunner hit his target. He hit the ammunition depot. That was the end of the war for me. I was destroyed. All that was left of me was a dry shell. The war had done its work. In the blink of an eye, some giant juicer had squeezed me dry. Concussion, overheating, thirst, nervous tension, it all did its job. I think I walked for a while, unable to utter a word, then fell to my knees near the funnel where the two men were sitting. They were clearly not enared of my appearance. Their voices came to me as if from far away, and as if through absorbent cotton. "He can't talk. What do you think is wrong with him?" "Hell knows. Doesn't look like he's been hit. Concussion, maybe? Hey man, what's wrong with you? Say something. What do you think we should do with him?" "I have no idea. See, he's got a machine gun." Okay. It's been hot in here today. I wonder where the Japanese came from. I thought the coast was ours. They're underground, digging their own tunnels. Hey, I wish we could get some machine guns too. A rifle's not that handy. Look at that poor bastard. We should probably get him to the infirmary." "I think so too. The guy looks like hell." They stood up, took me under their arms and dragged me like a mannequin across the sand. I was like a walking doll with the most important mechanism broken. They dragged me to the doctor. The orderly laid me down on a blanket and attached a tag. Then he stuck a needle in my arm from which ran a tube to a bottle of liquid hanging from a rack. The guys who brought me in squatted down next to me. What's wrong with him, Doc?" "I don't know," the orderly answered. "It looks like a severe concussion. I'll send him to the hospital ship." One of the guys looked longingly at my machine gun. His look was more eloquent than any words. He seemed to be saying, "You won't need that thing anymore anyway, but we could really use it." I gave him a look that said he could have the machine gun. He immediately put it on his shoulder and looked extremely pleased. Then the boys left. They had done the deed and were rewarded. Besides me, there were about half a dozen other casualties here. We were lying on the sand, and I was lazily wondering whether the Japanese artilleryman would have been able to hit me after all if he hadn't hit the ammunition depot earlier. Eventually a boat came up behind us and took us with a roar to a hospital ship that was standing in the roadstead. And I felt ashamed. Others were badly wounded, they were in pain, some of them were even injected with morphine. And here I was lying in a corner hole without a scratch. The war ended in humiliation. I was ashamed. My soul had left me. It wanted to hide from the demanding eyes that greeted us when the boat was boarded. People in white coats stood at the railing, trying with all their attention to determine who should be helped first. I flinched from the evaluating gaze, when quite suddenly the doctor, standing in the centre, pointed at me and said, "Let's get this one downstairs immediately." I was picked up, stripped naked and carried down the gangway, carried into some room, laid on a table and a needle stuck in my arm again. Fluid flowed into my dried-up body, and with it the warmth of returning self-respect. The shame vanished the moment the pointing finger picked me out. I was indeed wounded, and I needed immediate help. Unknowingly, the doctor had given me my soul back. So the war was over for me. I was moved from the operating room to my bed, and 3 days later I regained my speech and my ability to walk. Every day for a week, I climbed up the gangway to the deck and took long looks at Peleliu, which was about a mile from the ship. The fighting was going on there. We could hear the rumble of explosions. The ridge of Devil's Nose towered like a mountain over the pockmarked lunar surface. Everyday news came, but it was bleak. Yes, we were winning, but at what cost? Rutherford had been killed. I learned this from his comrade, a scrawny, short man who came to see me with him for his gun. This fellow was wounded too, in the arm. He told me that the shell had hit Rutherford right in the arm and torn him to pieces. "I'll see you at home." But now I had to go home alone. May he rest in peace. And the white man was killed. He was killed on the first night in a monstrous shelling attack. He may have been a fanatic, but he died looking the enemy in the face. May he rest in peace. And Artista too. He was killed by a cowardly hand. Returning alone from a night patrol, he jumped over the barbed wire fencing the CP and was shot by the major's orderly. A pathetic coward who didn't even have the courage to ask for the password before firing. And now the artist, a brave man, is dead. May he rest in peace. The three of our group, to whom we had not sung a grim serenade of death at Pow Woo Woo, Liberal, White Man, and Artist, were now dead. It was a real massacre. The casualties in the other battalions were also very heavy. Captain Dreadnought was killed by a sniper's bullet, and his company was a pitiful remnant. There were other guys who took part in the battles that I didn't mention in this book. I didn't have to. But they were also my friends, whose faces I have not forgotten and whose bravery and self-sacrifice made a great spiritual contribution to our nation. They died fighting on that coral atoll lost in the ocean, which the enemy would not let go of his grasp. May they rest in peace. The ships were moving away from the island. The battle was won. The Japanese on Peleliu were destroyed. There were 10,000 of them. My regiment, the 1st Marine Regiment, licked its wounds on the shore. There were only 28 men left of my battalion, 1,500 men who could hold a gun when the order came to launch the final assault on the Devil's Nose Ridge, riddled with countless cells of caves and fortifications. In other words, a very high price had been paid for the tiny sliver of coral called Peleliu Island. When the order came, 28 men rose from their trenches like shadows from tombs and went to the attack. They couldn't run, and they dragged their weapons behind them. But they were Marines and they obeyed orders and attacked. They were taken from the front lines in a semi-conscious state. The ships were moving away from the island. The severely wounded were to be transferred from our hospital ship to a perfectly equipped floating hospital that would go directly to the States. Among those who were destined for just such a fate was a soldier I found on the 3rd or 4th level below decks. He was lying on his bunk, suffering greatly from terrible wounds. It was stuffy. I drew water into my helmet to moisten his face and then brought a doctor to the unfortunate man. He gave him an injection which relieved the pain and ordered him to be bandaged. I was very sad to part with the soldier, but was cheered up when I saw that runner was present among the lightly wounded who had been transferred to our ship. The gun still had a Japanese bullet in his hand, of which he was extremely proud. When he saw me, the first thing he did was to remove his bandage and show me the wrapper. "That'll get me a lot of free booze back home in Buffalo," he chuckled. His good mood was reassuring, seeming to guarantee that the rest of ours were okay too. But of course I asked a question. "Do you know what's up with Crestfallen and Biggie? How are they doing?" "They're okay, I think, although Hohotan got hit pretty bad. Biggie got hit too, but lightly. He survived till the 6th day. Me and Hohotan got hit on the 4th. No, not exactly, but almost. I'll tell you." His face became sad at once, and a light of compassion flickered in his dark eyes. "Remember that guy from Texas who came in as a substitute? Such a nice, well-mannered kid. You probably don't know it, but it turns out he'd already lost 2 brothers in the war, and he was very afraid of death, that is, not afraid to die, but he thought his mother would not survive the death of her last son. So, on the 4th day, we started to be shelled with heavy mortars, and this poor man was hit by the first shell. The runner looked at me wistfully. Honestly, Lucky, I will never forget this nightmare. The orderly immediately injected him with morphine, but it didn't help. "I'm dying," he kept repeating. "I'm dying." Hohotan tried to calm him down, saying that he had just been wounded. Now the orderly would send him to the hospital, where he would surely be cured. But he kept saying, "I'm going away. I feel it." Holy sighed heavily, and after a long pause continued the story. Then the mortar shelling resumed, and immediately wounded Hotto ripped a large piece of meat from the upper thigh. The runner laughed unhappily. It was rather amusing. Surely you realize what Hototon thought of first. He was so frightened, as if he had lost the family jewels. "Are they all right?" he asked the orderly. Tell me the truth. Are they all right?" And the orderly only grinned and assured him that his manhood was intact, and he wasn't even in any danger. The wound was quite far away. Then Hohotan calmed down and even smiled. He was obviously very relieved, as if he had only cut his finger. I swear if, God forbid, the thing he feared had happened, he would have demanded that the orderly shoot him. The ship's engines vibrated and there was a soft humming sound. We were moving away from the island. Runner and I, along with everyone else, piled onto the rail for one last look at the damned island. Here also I saw Rutherford's mate with a bandaged arm. We gazed in silence at the receding Peleliu, shot up and covered with soot. A few surviving bushes could be seen on Devil's Nose Ridge, stretching their bare branches to the sky as if begging for forgiveness. We were on our way to Mapus Island to the Naval Hospital. There we were to meet Big Guy and poor, smooth-faced. His beautiful white skin yellowed like parchment around his small face. He had a kidney wound. He was hiccuping all the time, which undoubtedly increased the pain, but when he saw us, he smiled happily. Amish and Stump were also here, and very soon Mapus became a reunion place for the old guard. The same thing, only on a larger scale, awaited us in San Diego when we finally began to prepare to go home. Even Chuckles was there, leaning heavily on his crutch, but that didn't make him any less laughable. We could once again be the cheerful and carefree people we had been at the beginning, in New River. The ordeal we were preparing for was behind us, and our home was ahead of us. But for now we still kept our eyes on Peleyu. A little longer, and it would disappear over the horizon. The rocky island rapidly shrank in size until it became a tiny dot, and then it was gone. The ship was picking up speed. "Is this really it, boys?" Runner asked when we reached the open sea.